Welcome to ePAD training. This video is to demonstrate how to complete, submit and verify the midpoint interview and the final interview. Partway through the student's placement, a midpoint interview will need to be completed. This is required to be done by the practice assessor, as the student will be measured against professional values. Following the midpoint interview, the student should log into ePAD, navigate to the correct placement using the placement button, you'll see here that the last action that was taken was that the initial interview was approved. Then navigate to the midpoint interview by clicking Midpoint Interview button. The student's first job is to complete their self-assessment and reflection on their progress. So all they need to do is type in their summary of how they feel their knowledge, skills and attitudes and values have progressed since the initial interview. The student can then choose to add further learning development plan as they did in the initial interview by scrolling down to the bottom of the screen to the midpoint review section and clicking Add Entry, and then adding in any further learning and development needs, and how those have agreed that they will be achieved. Then click Submit. And keep adding those until all of the midpoint review learning and development needs have been added. The student can then choose to save for later in case they get interrupted halfway through doing their reflection, or they can save and submit to the practice assessor once they're happy. So I'm going to save and submit. I'm going to select my practice assessor and drag and drop into the selected box. Please note, as I said earlier, the practice supervisor cannot be selected for this because the midpoint interview as well as the final interview need to be completed by the practice assessor. So once I've selected my practice assessor, I'm going to click OK, must request approval for midpoint interview. The practice assessor will now receive an email telling them that the student has submitted their midpoint interview for approval. The practice assessor can now log into ePAD in order to complete their side of the midpoint interview. So the practice assessor will log in, navigate to find the student on the Students button, find the correct student, and then find the relevant placement. You'll see here that the last action taken was that the midpoint interview was submitted. So we click into the placement, navigate to the midpoint interview, and this is where the practice assessor can mark the student against the relevant professional values. So each section of the professional values expands, and then the practice assessor goes through each one and ticks whether they feel that the student has met each of these professional values at this point at the midpoint interview. If you do not feel that they have met them, simply leave them blank. The practice assessor will be able to see the student's self-assessment reflection and then navigate down to type in their own comments for each area: knowledge, skills and attitudes and values. practice assessor will then be able to review the learning and development needs that have been added at the midpoint review, and then practice assessor can save for later. The practice assessor will also have a button that says submit over this side, and that will be the midpoint interview complete. The final interview is very, very similar. The student would initially log in to ePAD, navigate to the placement, and then select the final interview. As you can see, the fields are very similar to the midpoint interview. The student will then add in their self-assessment and reflection, and submit to the practice assessor. Once the student has submitted their final interview, the practice assessor will receive another email to notify them of the submission. The practice assessor then can click the link within that email to access ePAD, or they can log into ePAD, navigate their way to the student, the placement, and then the final interview. The practice assessor will complete professional values, just as they did at the midpoint, by ticking to confirm the student has achieved each of these, or by leaving it blank if they have not achieved. The practice assessor will then be able to review the student's self-assessment and reflection, complete their own comments regarding the student's knowledge, skills, and attitudes and values. The practice assessor will be able to identify any additional learning and development needs that can be taken forward to the next placement simply by adding them into this learning and development needs field here. The practice assessor has the option to save that for later in case they get interrupted. There will be a submit button here. And lastly, in the final interview, there's an action list. You can create an action simply by clicking the Create New Action. So I'm just going to add in an action list item, and then I'm going to add in what the student needs to do. I'm going to add in the support available and who is available, and then I'm going to add in a deadline for them to meet that. We can then submit that. The action plan will also show later in the central action plan area here, which will follow the student throughout their journey.